We just aren't willing to recognize this issue as the legacy, oppressive, confusing, abusive mess it is. It's not just relationship problems or two people with two different points of view. It is toxic. It's bad for your health. So, there's a lot of relationship advice out there, right? Let's talk a little bit about why this damn advice doesn't work for narcissistic relationships. So sometimes I think when I'm sort of in a masochistic mood, I read the stuff that relationship experts put out there. It makes me smile initially. I'm like, okay, I guess that would work. But then it saddens me because I know that many, if not most people who are in narcissistic relationships, especially in the early phase of narcissistic relationships, are desperate for knowing how can I make this relationship better, and they read it and they want to try it. I'll give you an example from my life of how this could work. I was recently trying to fix a camera that was outside my house that stopped working. I pulled it on and off, I plugged it on and off, I turned it around, I installed and uninstalled it, I did the little thing you're supposed to do with the computer and the phone, I called tech support, they said, well, we'll have you try it, do it yourself. I took a ladder out there, I followed all the directions they gave me for hours. Nothing worked. I tried everything for months. Then I had to pay someone to come out and fix it. When he got there, he looked at the camera, and he had the tools and the intelligence to take the whole installation apart, and then he showed me that water had corroded the wire. The original installer used the wrong kind of wire, so it had been corroded, and there was nothing I could have done that would have fixed it. He fixed it quite easily, and he was on his way. The entire experience, because it went on for like 4 months, it frustrated me, but when he came and went, it also relieved me. I was frustrated because I tried everything. I almost fell off the damn ladder. I wasted many hours, and I was told by the tech support people that I wasn't checking things right. And there's no way there couldn't have been a light on the damn camera. That was all gaslighting, right? And only after I exhausted all the options myself were they finally willing to send a real human being out, who then told me there was nothing I could have done. It was broken. He had to fix it. And frankly, my broken camera story is actually better in terms of an outcome than a story would be for a person going through a narcissistic relationship. At least my camera got fixed. For a person in a narcissistic relationship, the best we have got is, yeah, there's nothing you could do. But there's no pro that can come in and fix it. Goodness knows I've tried and I couldn't do that for anyone. So I'm reading this article that was called "The One Thing You Never Want to Do in a Relationship If You Want It to Survive." And the person went on to talk about her wonderful 22-year marriage and all the things that she does as a relationship expert, which of course are going to work for you because you have oh so much in common with her. So I wanted to figure out what that one thing was. So you don't have to go through the clickbaited hell I did. Let's just cut to the chase of the one thing you should never do. Ready? You should never talk without pausing. So I guess she was trying to say you should stop and carefully consider what you say so you don't say something hurtful or dismissive. Actually, it's absolutely wonderful guidance for healthy couples that don't need that much help. Maybe they need a little tune-up, but that's it. That one thing that she's suggesting is not going to help any narcissistic relationship out there. If you pause, they're going to keep talking over you. Anyhow, they're going to keep talking. Or if you pause too long, they will tell you that you're being passive-aggressive or giving them the silent treatment. In fact, you probably pause a lot in your arguments with a narcissistic partner because you are so confused. How's all that pausing working out for you? Now I was in the rabbit hole, right? So I keep reading the article to see what the other tidbits were. Because I could see that the first tip was never going to work for someone in a marriage or a long-term relationship with a narcissistic person. The other tips were to use a turning toward policy, which apparently means that you turn toward and face your partner when you're talking to them. The others were small acts of kindness, voicing gratitude, weekly dates. Okay, again, all of this is absolutely lovely guidance. It really is. I actually think it's not only just wonderful guidance for marriages. A lot of it could apply to friendships or close family. You could even tweak some of it for the workplace. I guess you lose the weekly date part, but the rest of it, Yes, we should always pause before we talk and take a minute so we don't say something we regret. We should respectfully face people when we talk to them. Be kind, be grateful. This is not theoretical physics, folks. But it becomes theoretical physics when we move into narcissistic relationships. The reason articles like this frustrate me, because it's not a bad article, she wasn't saying anything offensive, and the things she was saying were perfectly fine, but it frustrates me because people in narcissistic relationships feel so helpless that they go out there, they research stuff, they'll try anything, so they may start with this happily married relationship expert's advice and do this stuff. Well, the gratitude and then the kindnesses, the narcissistic person is going to interpret that as like, well, you're just giving me, like, yeah, of course you're treating me like this. That's the supply they feel entitled to anyhow. Then there's that whole turning toward part. Again, it's good human relationship hygiene to do that, but they may not. And you may still be talking to their back. And if you tell them to turn toward you and they don't want to do it, they will hit you with all kinds of dismissive stuff. The weekly dates, that's just luck. If they had a good day, you may have a nice time. But if you try to schedule something like this and it happens to meet up hits that they want to do, go out with friends or do something else that they prefer, trying to keep that weekly date on a schedule again means facing scorn and contempt. So you bring all this good stuff. How long is this sustainable if it is not being reciprocated? And for many of you, that answer may be decades because you have been doing it that long. But if you read an article like this, it's easy for survivors to feel that they haven't been doing it right, that they aren't being face forward enough or grateful enough or kind enough. Again, my frustration with articles like this is that ultimately they shame survivors and they don't frame any of this within a narcissistic abuse framework, that there's even a possibility of that. People who are not in relationships, who need a tune-up. Folks in narcissistic relationships, this isn't about tune-ups, right? I started this channel in part because I got frustrated with the relationship shaming that happens. Are you trying hard enough? Are you thanking your partner enough? Are you being nice enough to your partner? Are you making them feel good enough? Are you facing them enough? Enough. Because all of that is with little regard for what it does to a person to do all of this in a relationship and more and give up on themselves and never get any of the good stuff reciprocated. Until these so-called relationship experts recognize that the inflexibility, the rigidity, and the unchangeability of narcissism means that you will get nowhere and this will not change, they really need to put disclaimers on these articles. And that what survivors and people in narcissistic relationship need is a validation of their experience, permission for radical acceptance, realistic expectations, workarounds, building up other supports, and if you decide to leave, to validate that decision for them. I wish I lived in that world where it was that simple. It's not. And so for people in narcissistic relationships, stop going to the mainstream fix-it literature to get guidance to fix something that you cannot fix and that often ends up leaving you mired in shame and self-blame. I am happy for people who are in the healthy relationships that can thrive after a few date nights and thank yous. Folks, that's not this. So again, it doesn't feel good, and it would be nice if these articles could be framed in that way, but that wouldn't be as catchy, would it? Good advice is often annoying. Bad advice never is. And I thought, wow, this is a great one. And you know I love Proverbs and kind of found this treasure trove of sort of global Proverbs, which has been really interesting. I love this proverb for survivors of narcissistic abuse. It's interesting because anyone going through a toxic relationship, especially in the early days when you're just learning what it's about, don't always want good advice because it really goes against the grain of the trauma-bonded justifications. The bad advice is often enabling and based on fairy tale fantasy. So, what does good advice for survivors of narcissistic abuse look like? It's things like radical acceptance. It's not going to get better, so make your decisions accordingly. Keep your expectations realistic. It's not your fault. Don't engage. Those are the classics, right? So you might be wondering, okay then, Dr. Ramani, what is bad advice for a narcissistic relationship? Things like, just give it a chance. Let a little time pass and it'll get better. Maybe you should try working on communication. Have a date night. Why don't you just extend the olive branch? They're just acting like this because they love you so much they don't know what to do. Or, the devil you know is better than being single. Now, here's the rub. Lots of survivors of narcissistic abuse initially do not want to hear that it is rigid and unchanging and uncomfortable. They would rather hear that it will all work out and such is the trauma bond and holding out for more good days after the bad ones, right? The narcissistic folks play a very manipulative game. Love bombing, good seductive days, they get you on the hook, and then they withhold and they withdraw. You want that good stuff back, so you do whatever you can to get back to what it was. And they give it back, and then they take it back. And that game of cat and mouse continues for the duration of the narcissistic relationship. But unfortunately, very little relationship advice out there is informed by knowledge of narcissism. The advice is more along the lines of, oh, I think he's just really into you. He's just playing hard to get. Or things like, she has a tough job, that's why it's been tough. Or they don't mean it. Or love is hard. Or maybe they're just so intimidated by you. On and on. Advice that allows a person to keep justifying the bad behavior in the relationship and hold out for more of those love-bombed moments. The core of bad advice in a narcissistic relationship is anything that fosters false hope and keeps the person in a future-faked mess. And because so many people still hold on to messed up fairy tales that love is hard and you have to win people over and all the rest of it, the advice, the bad advice, comes from that place. But it's easier to take the bad advice because it allows people to hold on. Think of all the people out there that seek the guidance of future predicting magical psychic people when they are in narcissistic relationships. These sorts of psychic medium, whatever people they are, they often give guidance like, oh, I see a dark cloud around him. I sense that he's going to meet someone else, but it's not going to go well. He'll feel pulled back to your light, and then he'll regret it and come back in a year. The danger of that kind of stuff is that it fuels hope. And instead of the person focusing on their healing, there's a risk of a person just sort of counting off the next year until the psychic prediction of the narcissistic person coming back comes to fruition. Because really what this sort of psychic guidance is saying is he's going to go seek out new supply, he'll blow up the new relationship and hoover you. I'm telling you that for free. The part that anyone trying to predict the future is going to get wrong is when they say, oh, they'll regret it and see your light. But unfortunately, many people prey upon the vulnerabilities of survivors. And whether psychic or not, will give the prognostication that the narcissist will see it and come back and see how much you love them. Or they'll get hurt in their new relationship and that there'll be signs from the heavens and all of that. That will feel much more palatable than somebody rolling up with good advice and telling you, this person's not going to change. You need to work on healing and moving forward and not blaming yourself and recognizing there'll be grief. Not so interesting. So bad advice, which is often advice that is designed around maintaining the status quo, sort of the simpler path forward, and often steeped in denial, is in fact easier to follow. Bad advice is often appeasing and what you want to hear, which means then that the person offering the advice doesn't have to see your distress or your disappointment. It's more validating to give advice that cheers a person up than advice that challenges them. And in the world of narcissism and narcissistic abuse, the wise advice does challenge people. And I recognize that that's not very pleasant. Many, many times people can't give good advice because they don't understand narcissism. It goes against all we want to believe, or what many people want to believe about people being able to change or grow or have empathy, or that people who claim to love us always have our best interests at heart. It is really soul-crushing to believe otherwise. However, pain is a necessary stop on the train to growth, and the good advice giver is one who may be willing to give the tough word and call out the toxicity, even if you don't like it. Over the years, I have had more than a few friends in toxic relationships, and I have had to be the unfortunate messenger with, I don't know if I can sit here and claim it was good advice, but it was definitely informed advice. And in giving that informed advice, they've not been pleased about it. And I've gotten pushback like, Ram, I don't want to hear this, or you are hurting me by telling me this, or stop telling me this, and they'll cry. Listen, I have to live with myself, so I wasn't ever going to say, oh, no, I can see you're upset. Maybe they really are going to change. I would just shut my mouth, be there for them, and know that maybe at some point my words would hit. And in some cases, they wouldn't. I loved this French proverb because I have never heard it sort of phrased so succinctly. Good advice really is annoying, while bad advice often just enables and allows justification to sustain. Sometimes if you don't want to incur someone's wrath, giving no advice may be the safest path forward. But too often, the more uncomfortable path is usually the path to growth. And nowhere is that more true than in pushing through narcissistic abuse. Folks, it's going to hurt before it feels better. Toxic positivity is a pattern that is sort of seen in people who sort of require people to be happy and positive all the time, who don't allow space for normal, what we call dysphoric or negative emotions like anxiety or sadness or worry. And many a self-improvement cult has arisen out of people being told their dysphoric or sad emotions reflected some sort of damage or limitation within them, and then they would have those emotions be judged harshly by the other people in the so-called cult. Now, as a general rule, it is useful. Emotions are useful because there are messengers, right? And in most cases, maybe not all, but in most cases, emotions pass. We have them and then they work them their way through. But we need to heed our emotions as the messengers and signals that they are. And what we need to do is learn appropriate ways of being with our emotions and learning to respond in the face of them. Now, the toxic positivity folks are the ones who shame people for not walking around eternally optimistic. And they're fully convinced of their power all of the time. They will often invoke and weaponize all kinds of new age hooey to do this sort of shaming of negative emotions, and will tell you, none of that negative talk, come on now, shift your mindset. You have the power of your mind. Set a happy intention. You are the master of your mind. And for people who are facing oppressive and dominant and abusive behavior, not just from a partner or a family member, but from the world at large, you can set all of the damned intentions and mind power you want. You can't change the world, and you shouldn't blame yourself for that. Because that's what ends up happening in this toxically positive space, that somehow your mind is so magical that it could change everything, including the other toxic people in it. So in the toxic positivity world, these are folks who don't like hearing about narcissism. it's just too negative for them. And it's interesting because a fair number of these toxically positive folks are narcissistic themselves. Narcissism feels like it's too defeatist a conversation for them. It feels too negative. And this idea that something can't change, well, that's just way too much for them. To them, you've got your mind power that should be able to change anything, right? In the toxic positivity world, everything can be changed, they think. And if you believe it can't be changed, well, that's your fault. Interestingly, the toxic positivity folks may also not be that bothered, as it were, at the kinds of narcissistic traits and qualities we see in people, and instead they may frame narcissistic people as people who are just tough leaders, or who think out of the box, or who are just able to make direct decisions. And that if we are having trouble in a relationship with them, then it's our fault. Please don't get me started on this. This one gets me going. This toxic positivity movement is actually observed, and we see it in a certain subset of motivational speakers, and basically anyone who basically tries to silence people who are trying to say, hey, not everything is good. So those people like me who are saying not everything is good, and we need to support people through it. No, 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 no. They don't want to hear that. Toxically positive enablers will also convert all of your emotions about other people into a projection. They'll say things to you like, well, you're angry at that person because you're just disappointed in yourself. And that can leave you with even more self-doubt, especially if that person you're angry at is a gaslighting, invalidating, narcissistic person. So, as you can imagine, the toxic positivity going through a narcissistic relationship enablers, and at times they are even re-traumatizing. If a person is going through a narcissistic relationship, the toxic positivity enabler will more often than not blame the person who is going through the narcissistic abuse, telling them things like, well, maybe you weren't clear-headed when you set that intention, or maybe you just aren't manifesting it the right way, or maybe you really don't want to be out of this relationship, or my favorite toxic positivity enabling sentence, maybe you like being treated like this. When I hear that stuff, I want to curse. The toxic positivity folks are the individual enablers. The toxic positivity movement means that there are entire systems that enable narcissism. I have had numerous people tell me that they have had everyone from so-called spiritual teachers to so-called healers to coaches to yoga teachers to energy healers to therapists tell them that instead of calling the relationship toxic or your partner narcissistic or toxic, look within you, because that is within your control, and ask yourself why you need to label it this way, and ask yourself what you are responsible for in this other person's behavior. They will also go on to say that, oh, come now, that's not nice. People aren't toxic, and that your negative feelings can be changed by shifting your mindset. Listen, you cannot look within yourself until you are educated about what is also it's outside of you, so you can make an informed decision. Let's, the positivity folks, leave that rather important bit out. Sure, so when a person's reality is being denied, or they are not being shown basic human empathy, or they are being invalidated, exactly how are they supposed to take responsibility and control? It's like blaming someone's face for being in the way of another person's fist. But this idea of personal responsibility to a fault, coupled with the unwillingness for so many Healy types to see narcissistic relationships clearly, means that many survivors walk around in a state of self-blame, self-shame, and self-gaslighting for years and even decades longer than they need to. The toxic positivity enabling is one of the major reasons why this entire issue of narcissism and what it does to other people isn't getting addressed systematically. Why positive, toxically positive, motivational speakers make millions and millions of dollars and are embraced by the healing pundits who love nice and easy love and light solutions, with the rest of us who are trying to address narcissism and narcissistic abuse bringing up the rear without nearly as much reach. This message on narcissism is not as cheerful as being positive. I know that. Listen, I have no doubt that positivity is nice, and it must actually be fun. I am pessimistic by nature, and I think I was born that way, and it's in my DNA, so I own it. It's not my natural groove. I gotta tell you, sometimes I really love the reassurance that comes from positive people. And frankly, I really do believe in taking personal responsibility, especially once you have all of the facts. And that is why when people are being told to change themselves and look inward when they are in a difficult relationship, I can get behind that, but only if they have all the facts. Facts including the idea that narcissism really doesn't change, that none of this is really your fault, that there's nothing you can do, and that you can't win at this. And once you know that, once you really get the parameters of what these antagonistic relationships are about, yep, then I can get behind a person having to take responsibility when they're in one of these relationships and making a decision. But blaming a person for being sad or anxious or confused when they're being narcissistically abused, that's BS. Toxic positivity enabling is dangerous. It is systemic and it is everywhere. Someone invalidating you is not your fault. No, it's not because your energy is off. It's just not okay. Someone gaslighting you is not your fault. You feeling sad if someone is conducting themselves this way with you is normal. And when someone tells you to turn that frown upside down because you're responsible for it, you can tell them in whatever way works for you where to put that advice. That frown of yours, I'm actually pretty confident it will work itself out. Once you understand what these relationships are about, and you can break through the cognitive dissonance and the trauma bonding. Nobody can rush your healing. There is no magical yoga pose or crystal or self-development course or a mantra that can do it. Get the information on what these toxic personality styles are about. Be kind to yourself and trust the process. It will happen. And while you are setting up the boundaries and the disengagement around the narcissistic folks, you may want to cast that net a little wider, and you may want to do that with the toxically positive enablers as well. The toxically positive enablers are actually a little bit different than the Pollyannas. The Pollyannas actually take a little bit more of a simplistic stance. Everybody has good in them. The toxically positive ones take this a level up. They actually blame you and want you to take responsibility for everything that happens to you, even the narcissistic abuse, and will blame you when you have a negative mood for not having a strong enough mind to get your way out of it. I actually do believe that there's a lot of space and utility to positivity, but I am not a fan of empty, inane, sort of jump on the train with everyone else positivity. I think that positivity has to come from a place of you understanding what these kinds of difficult relationships are about, and ultimately feeling the freedom, the power, and the conviction to make decisions that work for you. Don't let anyone ever tell you to smile for them because it's good for you, and if you don't, it's because your energy's off. Your energy's right on. You just need the right information to make the best choice for you. Let's talk about the tyranny of self-care, shall we? Self-care is a really, to me, problematic conversation for survivors of narcissistic abuse. So as a survivor of narcissistic abuse, have you ever been told you need to do more self-care, get more sleep, eat a Mediterranean diet, meditate, do a sound bath, do things that awaken your soul, create me time. How'd that work out for you? It's actually problematic guidance for many survivors. So let's break it down. This video kind of originated out of a few different places. Some conversations with survivors I've had, as well as well-intended people who do want to help. And I think, unfortunately, we live in a world of quick and dirty listicle TikTok 90-second guidance. So why would somebody push back on something as seemingly easy as 8 hours of sleep and a kale salad? There's a few reasons. Let's start with the trauma part. The reason self-care works, because it does work with the right person, but it works, is because it should not only relax you, but nourish you. The rest, the nutrition, not only is it physically good for you, it can break rumination cycles because it's showing you that you value yourself enough to put some time into you. But to do these things means that you're less vigilant. Vigilance is a part of a trauma response. Trauma survivors, and by trauma, I am using this term more widely to also include what we're observing in people who are recovering from moderate to severe narcissistic abuse and complex trauma as well. A lot of that on edge, vigilant, monitoring, being careful about what you say and do, and just being on high alert, all of that is typically what we see in survivors of narcissistic abuse and trauma. And if you become distracted, because you're all self-caring, you might miss something. And then chaos and danger will ensue. At least that's what your nervous system believes, and it may have played out like that when you were a child. Self-care actually does mean stepping down a bit, dropping some of that vigilance. Sleep is a struggle for survivors. Even meditation can initially be tough because of all the rumination, and just relaxing can feel like an impossibility because it might honestly feel dangerous if your guard comes down. Then there's the even worse part, I think, for survivors, which is the shaming part. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse will say if they do attempt to do something for themselves in the name of self-care, whatever it is, they will be shamed and gaslighted and contemptuously derided. Narcissists might say something like, "Oh wow, always putting yourself first, aren't you?" Or, "Oh my goodness, well I work all day and you're here taking care of yourself." With no ironic awareness, by the way, by those narcissists that they put themselves first all the time. You'll be criticized for spending money, being lazy, being self-centered and selfish. You'll be mocked for meditating. And if you're still stuck in this relationship, or still find yourself falling into their invalidating rabbit holes, then you may just think, damn, it may actually be less taxing to not self-care at all, or if I do it, to do it in secret. Survivors also believe that if they were to do more and more and more for the narcissistic person, then the relationship will get better or be okay. If I cook, if I clean, if I have sex, if I do more work, if I earn more money, if I be nicer, if I be quieter, if I be smarter, if I be in better shape, if I give them more hugs, you know the list, then the narcissist will be change, or it'll at least be okay. There's nothing more than you can do in these relationships. But because of this mindset, it means that survivors are putting their effort into doing better for the narcissistic person all the time, and to subjugating their needs in favor of what the narcissist wants, and definitely not thinking about self-care. Then there's the bigger issue of the bigger issue. Obviously, anything that fosters bandwidth is going to be good for a survivor. That said, when we make self-care about bedtime routines and kale salads and yoga classes, we miss larger structural issues. Narcissistic folks are enabled by the world at large. People in narcissistic relationships are often doubted and have very little recourse. Therapists often don't recognize it. People who are narcissistically abused may feel confused and guilty and go, and then there'll be good days, there'll be bad days, and all of this fosters this false narrative, especially if you keep going back in and out of the relationship. Well, you keep going back, so that's your problem. We just aren't willing to recognize this issue as the legacy, oppressive, confusing, abusive mess it is. It's not just relationship problems or two people with two different points of view. It is toxic. It's bad for your health. Because many of you may feel, yep, I have actually been told to self-care by people around me, and for many reasons I can't. Maybe the reasons I've laid out in this video. Then I've had survivors of narcissistic abuse tell me, I feel stupid because I can't even do self-care right. So maybe I'm actually not all that. Maybe I am that not good enough is true. And self-care just becomes one more thing that a survivor is told that they should be doing, but simply can't find the path forward to do. People experiencing chronic narcissistic abuse need something a lot more than self-care. I know, as a survivor myself, I still struggle with guilt when I engage in self-care. I'm still waiting for someone to jump out and say, well, I guess you're on easy street, aren't you? I guess you're not working that hard anymore, do you? I guess you're not, you said you work so hard, I guess now you're taking a break. You may think, maybe like someone like me shouldn't care, but that's the problem. Survivors do care. We had to care. It's the vigilance. If survivors didn't care, you'd have told your abuser to F off a long time ago. But the very empathy that creates such depth in survivors also makes them prone to caring what other people think. The fear of being shamed or being off guard that self-care sometimes brings up, that's often a disincentive for survivors to engage in self-care as well. Listen, I would love for survivors of narcissistic abuse to engage in more self-care because it is a path forward into more self-valuation and, frankly, individuation, which are the goals of healing. But we have to start first with context, validation, safety, supporting survivors, and not treating self-care as a one-size-fits-all strategy. Before self-care is put out there as one more thing that people can fail at, first we need to recognize the barriers to this recommendation. And to all of you that are going through narcissistic abuse and have struggled with the self-care piece, I do hope that you're able to place that recommendation in a context and recognize that the greatest self-care that you can engage in and you can start with is to stop blaming yourself. Once you start there, maybe you can work your way up to that workout or that weekend nap. Let's talk today about this so-called age-defying life hack that is probably not going to work for you because you're watching this YouTube channel. A lot of you who are longtime watchers of this channel, and if you're new to this channel, please subscribe and hang around, but my long-term viewers, you know that one of my sick guilty pleasures are reading the tabloids and doing things like watching 90 Day Fiancé. It's kind of my busman's holiday from all of this narcissism stuff. So in my little daily tabloid crawl, I'm reading one of these tabloids and I come across a headline that says, Harvard longevity researcher who is 53 years old has taken his age back by a decade using 4 tricks. And they showed a picture of him, and the so-called current picture looks almost boy-like compared to the one from his 40s. Now listen, I'm 57, and I thought, more from a physical perspective, how can I take 10 years off of this old body that is starting to feel more and more like a car with about 300,000 miles on it? Like, okay, so I read the article. Now, the first tip of these age-defying hack tips was to run 3 times a week, which I interpreted to really mean exercise aerobically somewhat vigorously a few times a week. Okay, so I was like, I got it. No newsflash there. Great, sure. The second one is to drink matcha green tea twice a day. He, Mr. Harvard, has his made for him by a celebrity chef, whatever the hell that means. And I believe like this matcha green tea stuff is almost like this powdery, like they grind up the green tea leaves. So it's this green powdery stuff that gets mixed with water. And it almost looks more like green juice. Now, what we know is green tea is a great source of antioxidants. I was happy when I read that. I don't do the whole matcha celebrity thing, but sort of Dr. Ramani story, since 2008, I was in Japan. I went to go climb Mount Fuji. Every day since that day, for 15 years without exception, I have a large mug of green tea upon waking. Every day, come hell or high water. I carry little tea bags with me when I travel, so I'm never without. Now, I'm not sure it has helped, but I kind of hope it offsets all of the running that I am not doing. So I'm like, okay, green tea, got that one. He then says that he takes some other supplements that contain some thing that is in foods like red wine and chocolate. Kind of seems more fun to eat the chocolate, so I do that. The research on all that is unclear, so let's just call his whole red wine chocolate pill a placebo effect. But here comes tip number 4. If you do this, you can take 10 years off of your life. Ready for it? Here it comes. Reduce the stress in your life and avoid jerks, because being irritated by toxic, jerky people can drop your life expectancy. Thank you, Mr. Harvard Benjamin Button. He does this by setting aside quiet time each day to manage the stress. Okay, I get that. And then he avoids working with jerks. All right. So you and I both know what he means by jerks. Jerk is code for narcissistic person. Someone who is entitled and demanding and arrogant and has poor boundaries and is invalidating and demanding and manipulative and takes advantage of you and rages and lacks empathy and is egocentric. You know the drill. Now, at some level, I got to tell you, he's not wrong. I don't disagree. I've been saying since some of my earlier books that exposure to narcissistic people pretty much almost qualifies as a public health issue and really is doing harm to all of our health and to the population at large. I would actually say that consistent and deep exposure to narcissistic, antagonistic, toxic people is just as harmful as many other toxic processes like a sedentary lifestyle, unhealthy diet, hell, maybe even smoking. The chronic stress over months, years, lifetimes created by these relationships, not just when you're having to tangle with narcissistic people, but even in your so-called quiet moments, the anticipation of the next argument for even the smallest thing, the next gaslighting episode, having to sit through a good day, wondering when the next bad one was going to come. You know the drill. It's not just the bad days that make narcissistic relationships stressful. It's the total burden of the up, down, and all around of it. But this idea of just cut them out and don't deal with them, really? Because if there's only one thing I know, most of us cannot cut them all out. Leaving a job is typically not an option. Toxic colleagues and bosses are not, doesn't matter, can't just leave the job. Ending a relationship, distancing from a family, also not an option for a lot of people. So what then? If we have these problems, we're just supposed to die sooner? Do you age faster? What we do know about stress would argue that yes, you would. Chronic stress at this level impacts stuff like the length of your telomeres, which is in essence biological aging. Now listen, there is a luxury to be able to just wave your hand and say, out, out, all of you narcissistic and toxic people. It's time for me to drink my green tea after I take my run. Now, most folks have complex ties in their lives. They have one narcissistic parent, one not narcissistic parent, or they have their kids to have grandparents, or they have marriage and interlinked finances, or they have concerns about custody, or they're 25 to 30 years into a job where you'll get a pension in a few years, or an adult child who is narcissistic and you don't want to quit your own kid. A best friend that you've known forever. The list goes on. And even if you just decided to go scorched earth and remove all toxic people from your life, you may find that the fallout of doing that, the grief, the loss, the other practical and secondary and collateral losses are also taking a toll on you. The challenge of narcissistic relationships is that it is not that simple. And sure, if there are lower stakes toxic relationships that you can remove from your life, by all means do it right away. But it's not always that simple. And you could run marathons and consume gallons of green tea, but none of it will have the impact of addressing these toxic relationships. But unlike the running and the matcha, these relationships are something you have less control over. A key path forward is to be in these relationships differently. If you're going to stay, understand the architecture of a narcissistic relationship, the never-ending mess, the don't engage, don't personalize, it doesn't change, stick to the weather as a conversation, foster other connections, recognize that the good days won't last, and hold on to your reality and validate your own experience. Recognize that you can't count on the narcissistic person, that you will have to take care of important things yourself, and that they will feel entitled to your help while you can expect little from them. Or if you do, you will be reminded of it forever. So yes, these relationships, these narcissistic, toxic relationships, and it's not just working with the jerks, it's living with them, it's breaking bread with them, they're aging us, but you can manage them better and try and distance from the ones you can't. But when a very privileged, fancy Harvard doctory type, who likely has the power, the money, and the ability to distance from this situation, makes it sound as though it's some age-defying revelation to do that, it's a reminder that most folks out there don't recognize how complicated a mess narcissistic relationships are. And just to throw this in as a bonus, he also suggested that if we meditate like 20 to 22 hours per week, we could actually shave 20 years off of our life and think like a 25-year-old. First, if I had 22 hours a week to meditate, by definition, that means I've got a lot of time and probably money and not trying to juggle the 1,000 things that people like me do. So I would be less stressed just because I've got more time. And frankly, my brain works far better now than it did at 25. Youth may be vitality, but age is wisdom, especially when it comes to understanding toxic relationships. So everybody, keep drinking that matcha. Let me know how it works out for you. Thanks again.